The Glass Wife. A dark romance thriller. Chapter 1. The Body. She found him on a Thursday night, at 11:47, face down on the kitchen floor of the most expensive apartment she had ever lived in and never once called home. His name was Marcus Voss. He was her husband. And he was dead. Elena stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. The refrigerator hummed. The city moved 14 floors below, indifferent as always. She was wearing heels, she had just come in from the door, and she could feel the cold of the marble floor seeping through the thin leather soles, traveling up through her legs, settling somewhere in her chest. Or perhaps that cold was already there. Perhaps it had been there for years. She crossed the kitchen slowly. She knelt beside him. She pressed her palm flat against his back, a reflex, something old and desperate and human, and felt nothing move beneath her hand. No breath. No heartbeat. Nothing. The knife was still in him. Buried to the handle between his shoulder blades, silver-handled, one of a set her mother had given them as a wedding gift. She had always thought it strange to give knives as a wedding gift. She thought so again now. She pulled the knife out. She would not be able to explain this later, not well, not in a way that sounded rational, but in the moment it felt necessary. It felt like the last thing she could do for him. Remove the thing that had killed him. As though that would change anything at all. It did not change anything at all. She set the knife on the counter. She washed her hands. She stood at the sink and looked out the window at the glittering spread of Lower Manhattan, and she thought about the last real conversation she had with Marcus, 3 days ago, before he stopped coming home. He had been standing almost exactly where she was standing now. He had his back to her. When he turned around, his face had the look she had come to recognize over 7 years of marriage. The look that meant he was about to tell her something that was shaped like honesty but was not actually honesty. He had said, "If anything happens to me, don't trust the people who say they're trying to help you. Especially him." She had asked who him was. Marcus had smiled his cold beautiful smile and said she would know when the time came. The time had come. She dried her hands on a kitchen towel. She picked up her phone. She dialed 911 and told them her husband was dead, in a voice so steady it would haunt her for months afterward. Then she went to the bedroom, changed her dress, and dropped the bloodied silk down the building's incinerator chute. And then she sat in the living room and waited, with her hands folded in her lap, for whatever was going to happen next. Chapter 2. The Detective. The first police officers arrived in 11 minutes. They were young and efficient and not very perceptive, which was fine. They cordoned off the kitchen. They asked her the preliminary questions. They handed her a bottle of water she did not open. The detective arrived 40 minutes after that. He was not what she had expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected, someone worn down, perhaps. Someone who had seen too much and let it show. That was what she had imagined, in the abstract moments when she had allowed herself to imagine this night. But this man was none of those things. He was tall, dark-haired, slightly too angular to be handsome in a comfortable way. He wore a grey coat over a dark shirt and he moved through the apartment the way water moves around objects, not hesitating, not rushing, simply finding the path of least resistance. He looked at the kitchen the way a surgeon looks at a scan. Not reacting. Calculating. His name was Detective Luca Morrow. He sat down across from her at the dining room table and he looked at her for a long, quiet moment before he said a single word. That word was, talk. And so she talked. She told him she had been at her sister's apartment until 9 o'clock. She had taken a taxi home. She had found the front door unlocked unusual, she said, because Marcus was meticulous about locks, about security, about all the small rituals of a man with something to protect. She had come inside. She had gone to the kitchen. She had found him. She told it cleanly. logically, as she had rehearsed it, in the taxi, on the way home. The detective listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't seem particularly upset, Mrs. Voss." And she said, very quietly, that she had been trying extremely hard not to fall apart in front of a stranger. He looked at her. He had dark eyes, coal-colored, the kind that seemed to be receiving more information than they were giving. He said, "I have seen you before. 3 weeks ago. You were standing on the corner of West Broadway, looking up at this building. You stood there for about 6 minutes. Then you walked away." She felt something shift behind her sternum. Something careful and cold. She asked him if he had been watching her building. He told her no. He had been watching her husband. The silence that followed lasted a long time. The refrigerator had stopped humming. The city below had gone quiet in the way cities never actually go quiet but sometimes seem to. Elena looked at the man across the table from her, this stranger with his calculating eyes and his grey coat, and she made a decision that she would spend the next 6 months wondering about whether it was the right one, whether she had had any other option at all. She told him she knew things about Marcus. About what Marcus had been. She told him she had documentation, photographs, recordings. She told him it had been sitting in a storage unit in Red Hook for 3 months, waiting for a moment exactly like this one, a moment when the pretense was over, when the question was no longer how to survive the secret but what to do with it now that the secret had survived her. Detective Morrow did not move. He did not blink. He said, "Show me." And she said, "Not yet. First tell me something true." Chapter 3. What Marcus was. She had found the storage unit by accident, or what felt like accident and was probably something else, some instinct too quiet to name, pulling her toward the truth the way water pulls toward low ground. Marcus had gone to Geneva. A conference, he said. 3 days, he said. She had gone through his study, not searching, she told herself at the time, just tidying, just being the wife she had never quite managed to be convincingly, and behind a false panel in the back of the bookshelf she had found a key on a plain metal ring. No label. No explanation. She had stared at it for a very long time. Then she had put it in her pocket and driven to every storage facility within 10 miles of their apartment until one of the keys fit. Inside the unit there was a metal shelving unit, floor to ceiling, stacked with files in labeled folders. There were photographs, surveillance style, taken from distance, of men she did not recognize in places she could not identify. There were documents in English, French, and a language she thought might be Czech. There were bank statements, dozens of them, from accounts she had never known existed. And there were accounts in her name. She had not opened any account at a private bank. She had not signed for a brokerage in the Cayman Islands. She had not authorized a company in Luxembourg to use her identity as a founding director. But her signature was on all of it, reproduced perfectly, or near enough that she had to look 3 times to be certain it was not real. Near the bottom of one of the boxes, she found the ledger. Leather-bound, handwritten in Marcus's precise European script. 117 names arranged in columns beside numbers and dates and 3 letter codes she did not understand but eventually decoded as city abbreviations. Money, moving from person to person across borders and time zones, and organizations that were not, on their surface, the kind of organizations that handled large amounts of untraceable cash. She photographed everything on her phone. She memorized what she could. She put it back exactly as she had found it, drove home, made dinner, poured 2 glasses of wine, and sat across from her husband when he returned from Geneva 3 days later, and listened to him talk about the conference, about the panel he had sat on, about the restaurant that had the best risotto he had ever eaten. She smiled. She asked questions. She did not let any of the knowing show on her face. She had been doing this, in one form or another, for the 3 months since. Sitting with a secret so large and so dangerous that she sometimes could not breathe around it. Watching her husband and understanding for the first time, fully, bodily, in the way you only understand things that cannot be, and felt that she did not know who he was. That she had never known. That 7 years of her life had been lived inside someone else's story. She told all of this to Detective Morrow in the flat grey light of 2 in the morning, seated across from him at her own dining room table, and when she finished, she reached inside her coat and slid a small black flash drive across the table toward him. She told him the drive contained 41 audio recordings. Some of them were Marcus documenting his own activities, speaking to the drive the way some people speak to a therapist, confessing, cataloguing, perhaps believing that if he named the things he had done they would stop pressing so hard against the inside of his chest. Others were recordings of conversations Marcus had with other people. Business conversations. Negotiation conversations. One of them, she told the detective, was a recording of a conversation between Marcus and a man named Raymond Hale, in which Hale had told Marcus very clearly that if he did not continue to move money through the network, the alternative would be considerably worse than prison. She watched Detective Morrow's face when she said the name Raymond Hale. She watched something move through him that he did not let reach the surface, something that was not surprise, exactly, but recognition. The particular, terrible recognition of a thing you have feared being confirmed. She asked him if he knew the name. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said yes. Raymond Hale was his commanding officer. His direct superior. The man who had assigned him to surveil Marcus Voss in the first place. Chapter 4. The hour before dawn. They worked through what remained of the night. Files across the dining table. His laptop pulling records against her photographs. The city going quieter and quieter outside until it reached that particular silence of 4 in the morning that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. She made coffee. He did not ask her to. She brought 2 cups and set one beside his laptop without a word, and he took it without looking up, and there was something in that small, wordless exchange that felt more intimate than anything she had shared with her husband in the last 3 years of their marriage. By 3:30 they had confirmed what she had suspected. The shell companies, the accounts, the flow of money, all of it led back to Hale. Hale had built the network. Marcus had run it, under threat, and had spent years quietly documenting everything he ran in case the day ever came when documentation was the only thing standing between him and the bottom of the Hudson River. That day, it seemed, had come. Morrow's phone rang at 3:47. He looked at the screen. He set the phone face down on the table without answering. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because some things do not require words. The act of not answering that call was a line being crossed. They both knew it. She said, "What happens now?" He said he was not sure yet. He said that whoever had killed Marcus had done it cleanly, professionally, not a crime of passion but an execution, methodical and quiet. He said that the same person who had ordered the surveillance on Marcus was almost certainly the same person who had decided, when the surveillance was not producing the results he wanted, to simply remove the problem entirely. She said, "He is going to try to remove me next." Morrow looked at her. He did not tell her she was wrong. He said, "Not if we move first." She asked him why he was doing this. She was his suspect. She was the most obvious person in the city to have killed her husband. He had every professional reason to put her across an interrogation table and very little reason to sit beside her at 4 in the morning reviewing evidence that implicated his own commanding officer. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he had known something was wrong with this case from the beginning. From the moment Hale handed him the file, something had been off, the way the evidence was arranged too neatly, the way Marcus Voss's crimes were documented almost as though someone wanted them documented, built into a structure that could be produced quickly. He had pushed that feeling down because pushing down bad feelings was something he was professionally accomplished at. But sitting here now, he said, he could not push it any further. She looked at him across the spread of papers and photographs and numbers that represented the wreckage of 7 years of her life. He was not a comfortable man to look at. There was too much going on behind his eyes, too much that he controlled rather than expressed, but there was something in him that she recognized. The specific quality of a person who had been carrying something alone for too long. She knew that quality intimately. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and direct and said everything that neither of them had the language to say otherwise. He kissed her back immediately, no hesitation, and that absence of hesitation told her something about him that his controlled face never would. Then they both pulled back and sat in the silence of 4 a.m. with the city breathing below them and the evidence of an enormous crime spread between them on the table. She said she supposed that was inadvisable. He agreed that it was. Neither of them moved. And outside, the first grey suggestion of dawn began to creep up behind the buildings to the east, quiet and indifferent and carrying with it the promise of whatever was about to come next. Chapter 5. The Move. By 6 a.m. they had a plan. It was not a perfect plan. Perfect plans, Morrow told her, were a fiction invented by people who had never needed one. Real plans had cracks in them. The point was to move fast enough that the cracks did not matter. The plan was simple. The flash drive contained the audio recordings. The photographs were on her phone. Together, along with the bank records he had pulled up himself, they had enough to bring to the FBI field office on Lower Broadway, specifically to Agent Priya Okafor, who Morrow had known since his first year at the academy and who he described simply as the cleanest person in any building she had ever walked into. He contacted Okafor at 6:15. She responded in 4 minutes. She told them to come now, before the city woke up. They were in the elevator when Morrow's phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. 5 words. Badge suspended pending internal review. He showed her the screen without comment. She read it. She handed the phone back. She said, "How long do we have?" He said, "An hour. Maybe less." She said, "Then let us not waste it." The car was already outside the front of the building when they came through the lobby, dark, no plates, parked at an angle that told her everything she needed to know about its intentions. She and Morrow had anticipated this. They went through the building's service corridor, through the connecting maintenance passage to the building next door, and out through a side exit onto a street the car could not see. His car was 3 blocks north in a parking structure. They walked fast and did not speak. The morning was cold and blue and almost beautiful, the kind of Manhattan morning that appears between the end of night and the beginning of day and lasts approximately 12 minutes before the city swallows it entirely. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the version of him she had believed in at 24, when she had met him at a gallery opening, when he had said her name for the first time with that European precision that made it sound more significant than she had ever heard it before. She thought about the version she had slowly, over 7 years, understood him to be. And she thought about the thing he had done, deliberately, carefully, at some cost to himself, when he had decided to leave her a way out. Whatever Marcus was, and she was not naive about what he was, he had done that one thing. Given her the key. Built her the door. She thought he might have loved her, in his way. In the only way he knew how. She did not cry. She was not ready to cry yet. That would come later, in private, in the way that real grief always comes, not in the dramatic moments but in the quiet ones, unexpectedly, when the world has gone still enough to allow it. For now there was only the moving forward. Chapter 6. The corner of Worth Street. They were 2 blocks from the FBI building when the car cut them off. It came from a side street on the right, smooth and sudden, angling to a stop precisely in their path in the way that only someone with a great deal of practice at stopping things looked entirely casual about. The door opened. The man who stepped out was 63 years old, silver-haired, wearing a dark overcoat and the expression of someone who had never once in his life been made to feel that the rules applied to him. He was not large. He was not physically intimidating. His power was of a different kind entirely, the accumulated weight of years and money and the specific impunity of a man who had learned early that consequences were for other people. Raymond Hale looked at Elena Voss the way he looked at everything, as a problem to be managed. He said her name. He said she had had quite a night. Morrow stepped in front of her. She put her hand on his arm, not to stop him, just to be there, just to make the point that she was not a person who stood behind other people, and she looked at the man who had corrupted her husband, ordered his murder, and built the architecture of the lie her entire marriage had been constructed inside. Hale told Morrow that his badge was suspended and that anything he said could be used against him. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. The voice of a man who had made other men disappear and found it no more remarkable than paperwork. Morrow told him it was over. Hale smiled and said that was a very optimistic position for a suspended detective with no jurisdiction standing on a public street. And then Elena spoke. She reached up and touched the flash drive at her throat. She had put it on a chain that morning, quietly, deliberately, and then she held up her phone with the screen facing outward. The call had been running for 11 minutes. On the screen, Priya Okafor's face looked back at all of them, steady and attentive, and beside her in the frame were two people in federal jackets. She asked Agent Okafor if she was getting all of this. Okafor said every word, clearly and calmly. Then Okafor addressed Raymond Hale directly. She told him to please remain exactly where he was. She told him that 3 vehicles were currently en route to his position and would arrive in approximately 40 seconds. Hale stood very still. Something moved through his face in that moment, not quite fear, because a man like Hale had built too many walls between himself and the ability to feel fear directly. But something adjacent to it. The realization, arriving slowly, heavily, like something falling from a great height, that he had miscalculated. That the woman standing in front of him had been, from the very beginning, considerably more dangerous than he had assumed. He looked at Elena. He said, quietly, that her husband had been a fool to trust her with all of this. She looked back at him and said that Marcus had been a fool in almost every way she could name. But not that one. The federal vehicles turned the corner 38 seconds later. Epilogue. 6 months later. Raymond Hale was indicted on 43 counts in federal court. The proceedings were expected to take 2 years at minimum. 11 of the counts carried maximums that would ensure he would not leave a courtroom as a free man under any plausible interpretation of the law. The case against Elena Voss was formally closed within the first week following his arrest. The accounts in her name were traced to their forged origins, frozen, and ultimately removed from any record of her financial history. The ledger Marcus had left in the storage unit in Red Hook became Federal Exhibit No. 1 and was referenced in nearly every piece of subsequent reporting on the case, which was considerable. She sold the Tribeca penthouse. She could not have said precisely why. It was not grief, exactly, and it was not practical, since the apartment was beautiful and worth a great deal of money, but every morning she woke up there she felt the weight of a life she had not chosen pressing down on her from the marble floors and the high white ceilings, and she decided that she was done being pressed by things she had not chosen. She found an apartment on the west side, smaller, with windows that looked out over the water. She took her mother's last name back. She slept better than she had in years. Morrow's badge was reinstated following a 3-week internal affairs inquiry that cleared him of any wrongdoing and implicitly acknowledged that his suspended judgment had, in fact, been the most correct judgment anyone in his department had exercised in a considerable period. He did not go back to homicide. He transferred to Okafor's federal task force instead, which suited him in ways he had not expected. The scope was wider, the politics were different, the cases were slower and more complicated and required a kind of sustained, careful attention that felt more honest to him than anything he had done in years. He was good at the new work. He was, as he had always been, good at most things. He was less good at the personal ones. He found her apartment on a Sunday morning in early spring, 6 months and 4 days after the night they had spread Marcus's files across the dining table and changed the course of both their lives. He stood outside her building for a while. Long enough that he became aware of how absurd he looked. Long enough to have the argument with himself that he had been having, internally, for most of those 6 months, the argument about timing, and professionalism, and all the very good reasons that a man in his position had to keep a careful distance from the central witness in the most significant case of his career. The argument did not conclude definitively in either direction. He went up anyway. She opened the door and looked at him. She was wearing a blue sweater and holding a coffee cup, and her hair was loose, and she looked, in that moment, more like herself than she had at any point during the night they had met. As though everything that had happened since had stripped something away rather than adding to it. As though the Elena Voss standing in this doorway was closer to some original version of her that the years with Marcus had gradually covered over. He told her she could have called. She said he could have called. He said he was not sure she would have answered. She said she would have answered. She said this simply, without emphasis, in a tone that suggested it was obvious, and she was mildly surprised he had not known it. He stood in her doorway with 2 coffees going cold in his hands and said her name the way he had said it that first night across the kitchen table, when everything had still been uncertain and dangerous and strangely, inexplicably alive. He said he was not an easy thing. He said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact, because he believed in facts, because facts were what he had always used to navigate the world, and this particular fact had been confirmed enough times in his life that he no longer contested it. He said the timing was what it was. He said he knew how it looked. She said it looked like a man standing at her door at 8 in the morning with 2 coffees. He started to say her name again. She said his instead. She stepped back. She opened the door wider. She said, "Come inside." He did. He did not leave until the following Tuesday. And the city outside, enormous and indifferent and carrying within it, as it always has, more second chances than anyone who needs one ever quite believes, went on. The end.